And we're live, streaming from the footsteps of New York City. We are Music Matters with Jason Tramm, and thank you so much for joining us for a unique podcast community where we explore the issues and challenges of the performing arts world as seen through the eyes of distinguished colleagues. Please remember to subscribe to us on YouTube and smash that bell icon for the most up-to-date information on upcoming guests and topics. We love it when you like and share our videos. It helps our community grow. We recently hit 1,358 subscribers in the last couple of days. And thank you so much for helping us grow our community of music lovers and professional artists and everything in between. We have a wonderful show for you today with Mr. Dr. Jan Swafford, who is a distinguished composer, lecturer, author, and everything in between, a distinguished and renowned teacher as well, a composer. So we're delighted he can join us. His compositions have been played around the country and the world, including the St. Louis Symphony, Indianapolis Symphony, Dutch Radio, and many, many others. He's also an acclaimed author, having written four very important books on different composers, from Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and an incredibly successful and acclaimed book by Charles Ives as well. So we're delighted he can join us, and thank you so much, Jan, for joining us today.
Thank you.
How are things? Are you in Massachusetts these days?
Yeah, I'm living in a farmhouse with two barns in the backyard right now in a farm town called Hadley.
Perfect. Get some beautiful inspirational sights, and that must be a beautiful place to compose and compose your thoughts.
Well, it's spring, so I'm starting to get stuck behind tractors on the road, and there are strange cars and trucks going back and forth in the backyard to the fields in the back. I lived in the suburbs of Boston for years, and this has been a great experience. But I returned to Western Massachusetts, where I lived 30 years ago. That's the general idea, and I'm going to be staying here.
Wonderful. Well, after the buzz and the craziness of the academic positions for so long, now you've got the time to think. And what are the next chapter going to look like for you? You've done such a distinguished career. What are you working on these days?
Well, I'm done with books because I think 4 gigantic books about composers is enough, and I want to return to composing entirely, except that I'm trying to assemble material for a collected essays in case anybody wants to publish that. It has a lot of my best writing, a certain amount of it unpublished, things that I just wrote and published and polished and stuck in the metaphorical drawer of the computer because there was really nobody to sell them to.
Your writings are so interesting to me. I'm in the middle of the Mozart book, and I've read some of the Beethoven. I've got them all on my queue to read. But the Mozart book is so interesting to me because, unlike almost all the other authors of major books, you're a well-known composer, and most are musicologists or writers. So you approach it in a very different way.
Well, to me, I've always felt that that's the main thing I bring to the table. That I don't, as far as I know, no composer in my experience has written biographies of composers before, at least not big ones. A friend of mine wrote a little one, David Matthews, on Benjamin Britten, whom he knew, which is quite nice, but I don't think anybody's written really big, ambitious biographies who is a composer. And I don't claim that gives me better insight than anybody else, but it gives me a different point of view. I think it's complementary to if you're a musicologist, you tend to look at a subject one way, if you're a theorist in a different way, and if you're a composer, I look at a sketch by Beethoven and I can see some of his thought processes is what it amounts to. And I don't think anybody else quite sees it that way. So to me, that's what I add to the dialogue, because I look at my work in the context of all the literature about a given person, and I want to do something that's complementary to everybody else. And that's from my particular point of view as a composer and as somebody who, I don't claim to be a great writer, but by and large, musicians are not word people. I just claim to be a pretty good writer for a musician.
When did you start that process of, now you obviously have a doctorate from Harvard, and you went to Harvard and you went to Yale for your master's and your doctorate. Did you
Yale School of Music.
That's right. Were you always writing? Of course you were writing and doing your dissertations, but when did you start writing for, program notes, lecturing, and when did you get the idea?
Much later. I'd always been interested in writing, but the main writing I did in college, other than academic papers, and my degree in college at Harvard is music too. But I was mainly interested in doing composing then. What I wrote for myself was a journal. And that's two ways I learned to write, really. That journal, hundreds of pages over the years, until I gave it up by my late 20s because I was just tired of all the stuff I was saying. And I wanted to get paid if I was going to be writing. Meanwhile, I had a job for years with this magazine called New England Monthly, where I wrote some articles, but mostly I wrote 100-word previews of about 20 to 25 upcoming concerts every month. And that is where I polish my writing, because those little blurbs is what it amounts to. It was almost like writing poetry. It was maddening to do, but I did that for about 5 years, every month. And that is where I learned to be succinct. And meanwhile, I also taught writing, college writing for 25 years, and just going over the basics of writing again and again and again, and learning how to shape paragraphs and sentences and teaching that. All that is what went into the writing, and that's based, I always had a certain amount of talent and interest in writing, but the talent before all this was, you could see that it was promising, but it was just awful. I had no taste. I had talent, but no taste, and no real skill. And so between the journal and the magazine writing and the teaching, I think I added the skill.
It's so interesting when you go from academic writing, which is meant for experts and people in the field, when you go to a general audience and you've got to make this make some really complicated issues appealing to people at a general level. And that takes it real.
It does. And as I used to tell my students, above all, who you're writing for has to do with how you write. And knowing the difference. Are you writing a scholarly article? Are you writing a program note for general listeners, for music lovers or general readers who don't know from, modulations to the submedian? So you use a different language, and you want to be interesting, and you want to be comprehensible and clear.
Why don't we go back in time and talk about the beginnings of your musical career and your musical studies? Did you always know you wanted to be a professional musician? Was that something you knew at the beginning?
Well, I got started in music and beginning band as a trombone player. And the reason I was a trombone player is because I was late for the first rehearsal of the beginning band. And the only thing the guy who rented the instruments had left in his truck was a trombone. That's the only thing he had left. So I became a trombone player. That first summer, there were 12, it was a huge beginning band, an incredible ruckus. There were 12 trombones, and I was 12th chair. I was terrible. I was so bad, but my mother was insistent on making me go back to band in the next summer to get me out of the house. So I started all over again in beginning band. And that summer, I was first chair because I had a head start.
You practiced.
No, I didn't. I didn't practice at all. And then I got to junior high. This is a terrible story, but I think it's funny. And I went into band in 7th grade, and I was sitting in third chair trombone behind a large girl named Donna. And this was pre-feminist era. This is about 1960. I was humiliated to be sitting behind a girl in the trombone section. And I had never been anything much in music. I'd never been much of a student. And I developed the first ambition of my life, which was to beat Donna in the junior high band auditions in 8th grade. And I practiced that summer, and I did. I became first chair trombone, which I thought would also make me interesting to girls. But by the time I learned that wasn't going to work, it was too late. I was already hooked and into music. And the first ambition I had in music, even though as soon as really by 9th grade, I was taking piano and composing a little bit, because as I got into classical music, which I did fairly around 8th, 9th grade, I just had this tremendous yearning in the pit of my stomach, literally. And it was a yearning to write, to do it myself. So I started playing piano in order to compose. But my idea of the height of a musical, I was in the band. I was eventually band captain in high school, and we had a famous high school marching band and so forth. I thought the epitome of a musical career was to be a high school band director. So that was my first professional musical ambition. But by the time I got into Harvard, I just wanted to be a composer. I didn't really know much about it, but that's what I wanted to do.
Who were the composers who you were most influenced by at that early age?
I think as a teenager, you sort of blunder into stuff. And that's what you do first. There's nothing systematic about it. I had this incredible experience, though. Again, this is a bit of a story, but to me, it's a foundation. You may have something. I think a lot of musicians have something like this. You might. When I was in 8th grade, I was first year in a sort of all East Tennessee junior high honors band, which is the most significant thing I had ever done in my life.
Sure.
And we played this tune called Song of Freedom, which I just loved. And I never bothered to look at the name of the composer. And I would occasionally think of it after that, and it gave me this kind of bittersweet feeling, like being in love. And I was in love with my first girlfriend at the time. And then one day I forgot it, and I was really crushed that I couldn't remember this beautiful tune anymore. So then in Chattanooga, Tennessee, my mother took me to concerts. There was an extraordinary concert series and ballet and opera, everything that came through town. And this was Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic. And they played the Copland El Salon Mexico, which I loved. And that made me a Copland fan. And Bernstein's Candide Overture. And then Brahms's First. And so I was sitting there. I was not used to symphonies at this point, and I'd never heard Brahms. And it got to the last movement, and the famous chorale melody started. Da dee da 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 da. That was the tune. That was the tune I'd played in band. And I was just thunderstruck. And that's the night I became a musician.
Those mountaintop experiences at such a young age, we never forget them, right? We never forget that inspiration. I think it was my first opera when I was in 8th grade or 7th grade, and just hearing, I heard, it was Una Fortiva Lagrima, and I'm like, I want to be in this world. I just want to be in this world.
Yeah. Well, I went on from there, and of course my first passions were Copland and Brahms, and then I started listening to some Wagner. And I remember a friend of mine who was extremely pretentious said, "You've got to listen to Bruckner." So we sat there one day in the library. I didn't have a record player. I had to go to the library with these brutally hard earphones and listen to mono records of what they happened to have. And we listened to all of Bruckner 8th sitting there in the library. And then my mother bought me a record player. And my Sunday school teacher worked at a radio station. He got me a lot of cheap records. And I just, suddenly had recordings of Brahms and Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky Rite of Spring. I'd be blasting the Rite of Spring in the 9th grade while we ate dinner. And my mother would be saying, "Can we turn this down a little, honey?"
As the Virgin's dancing herself to death around the
And these are these wonderful old London recordings. I don't know if you remember, they always had a scantily clad lady on the cover.
Appropriate for that piece.
It is. The Brahms had a scantily clad lady painted white holding a lyre standing on a cardboard pedestal. I still have some of those
that
records.
Works, but okay, it's interesting.
It worked for me, yeah. So I went on from there. I went into high school, and I was really, my mother taught at the high school, so I had been watching the marching band since I was 6 years old, and I just wanted to be in that band. And then we also had concert band. I was in the orchestra and the chorus. I mostly was doing music and drama in high school. I was the actor and the guy actor in my class. And I was Mr. Antrobus in The Skin of Our Teeth in the senior play. I wanted to be named most talented in senior superlatives, but my friend Mike Desvonic, who was a basketball player and painter and played trombone, he got most talented. I only got best actor. Um, but by then I was really, expanding all over the place. And I managed to get into Harvard because there was a bit of a deal with with my high school that they would let one or two people into Harvard every year, and I was the only one who applied that year. And even though um, my grades weren't fabulous, and I had not taken much math or science, or last year I had about 3 periods of music a day, maybe four, and 1 period of drama and English, and that was about it. But I managed to get in, and I'd never studied to speak of before. That was a shock. And I just remember flipping through the Harvard catalog, the music courses, and saying, someday when I'm done here, I'm going to know all this stuff. I can hardly understand the course descriptions at this point.
Wow.
And of course, it changed me a great deal. I was a nerd. I was really a kind of an outsider at Harvard. I didn't fit in at all. I was Mr. Anomie, really. And so my roommates and I were just all of us misfits at Harvard. But, I conducted, and I finally began to compose some stuff that wasn't too embarrassing and so forth and so on. And then got out, and the Vietnam War was on. And I had a very low draft number. So my choices were to go to Vietnam, go to Canada, or to teach, because at that point you could still get a teaching deferment. So I started teaching public school. And meanwhile, I said, I'm gonna ride out the war teaching and write music that will get me into wherever I want to go in graduate school. And that's what I did. And that included writing a 100-page wind ensemble piece.
Wow.
And that got me into the Yale School of Music.
Did you ever work with Bernstein during that period? Did he come back to Harvard, his alma mater?
That's a whole other story. Bernstein paid my way through Harvard.
Oh.
I had a Bernstein scholarship the whole time, which doesn't mean you had any contact with him. But my mother always said, honey, you've got to write Mr. Bernstein and thank him. And I said, no, Mama, someday I'll be at Tanglewood. He always shows up at Tanglewood. I'll be a composer at Tanglewood, and I'll thank him in person. And I did get into Tanglewood as a composer, but it took me a long time. I was about 27 or so when I got in, and I was one of the oldest fellowship students there. But, there would be this huge buzz every year when Bernstein, it's like the whole place started cooking when he was ready to show up. Were you a fellow there?
No, it was before my time, unfortunately.
Well, he showed up, and he was surrounded by conductors at all times walking around. You would have to knock people over to get to him. So being basically very shy and kind of nerdy, so meanwhile, I'm sorry to get into all these stories, but I'm a storyteller.
We love it.
That's one of the reasons. I said he was going to give a party for Tanglewood at the Curtis Hotel, which at that point was Tanglewood, after he did this huge concert performance in Tristan and Isolde. And so I said that would be a nice time, an informal thing to meet him and say thanks and say, I'm a composer. I really appreciate you've meant an enormous amount to me. Your example and your inspiration and so forth. So I was there, and all the Tanglewood students were sitting in this big ballroom eating cold cuts, and I heard this sound like a wave coming in. And I turned around, and about 400 people were running for the door. I mean, people were leaping over chairs and tables, knocking each other down. The doors flew open, and Bernstein and Gunther Schuller walked in arm in arm with this chaos around them. And there was this one guy who was a composer, but absolutely, he also conducted, and he hung out with the conductors, and he absolutely scorned the composers, wouldn't talk to us. He had somehow managed to get to the front of this mess. And he stuck his arm into he grabbed Bernstein's arm and grinned like an absolute ninny. And flashbulbs went off, and he had his picture taken with Leonard Bernstein. And Bernstein kind of shook him off and walked straight through into the ballroom, into a bar at the end. And it was sort of understood that you wouldn't go in there. And I was studying with Betsy Jolis, French composer at that point. And I watched Betsy get drunk in order to work up her courage to go in and talk to him. And finally she did. And I sort of peeped in, and she was nervously talking to him, and he was seated alone at this little table, drinking, fairly plastered himself, and sort of looking at her dully. And I just said, "This is the great world, and I'm never going to be part of it."
My mentor Alfredo Solipini was he was the director of the New Jersey State Opera and the founder, and I was his assistant conductor, and then I took over that company after he passed on. And Bernstein used to come to scout singers into Newark because Alfredo had the pipeline to some of the best singers in Europe. They would come and sing in Newark. Maestro Bernstein would come over, cross the river, and come to see at Symphony Hall in Newark and watch some of these European artists. And each act, he would come backstage drunker and drunker and drunker. By the end of Act 2, he was literally like slurring his speech. And
well, a few years after I was at Tanglewood, they did this thing with Bernstein where the composers would literally sit at his feet, and one after another, and playing their music while he got drunker and drunker. Until he was really pretty much blotto by the end of the night.
He went first.
Well, a friend of mine was one of them, but he grabbed him by the head, Dana Brayton, and said, "I feel your pain." And Dana was just thinking, "Get me out of here."
Such an interesting man. That's I love reading about because we're so used to with a lot of the early Beethoven biographies. They have all that kind of romantic concretion around them, right? And people like yourself strip that away to get to who this person actually was. Bernstein being such an interesting kind of he's a man with issues, brilliant obviously, but there were that's what makes the man complete, is reading about the issues and kind of what he went through and his thought process. And fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating. And I used to use Bernstein as one of my models, not the only one, for the idea that your level of craziness has to match your position in life. I mean, if you're Leonard Bernstein, you can be pretty much as crazy as you want.
You can wear a cape. Yep.
You could do some of the things he got away with you wouldn't now. I mean, I used to say the same about James Levine, and at a certain point he didn't get away with it anymore. But that he was excessive in every way, and managed to have just an extraordinary career. I think he modeled himself on Gershwin above all, as a composer, certainly. And he wasn't Gershwin, but he was extraordinary all the same. And Gershwin wasn't a conductor, of course.
Yeah, when you look at Bernstein's ability to tread musical theater and opera and I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah. I think Spielberg is making a movie of West Side Story, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that one.
Have they made a movie about Bernstein? Have they made a movie about his life?
I bet they will, but not that I know of. Actually, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
It would be very, in so many different ways. The man was so interesting.
No.
So when did you start writing your first pieces that you would consider your mature pieces? When did you find your compositional voice? And how does a composer find their compositional voice?
Well, I wrote two movements of a string quartet at Harvard, and that was by far the most sophisticated thing I'd written. I was studying with Earl Kim at the time. I never got into Leon Kirchner's seminar. Because by senior year, I wasn't writing stuff that he considered experimental enough, basically. I had friends of mine get into his seminar. I had no idea what they were doing, but they were writing, wilder stuff than I was. Anyway, I wrote the two more movements just after college, when I was teaching compulsory music appreciation in junior high. And it was played when I got to Yale, played very well. And I said, yep, that's a good experience. This piece is not allowed out of the house again. And during those 6 years between undergraduate and graduate school, I sort of began to I wrote that huge wind ensemble piece, which was very much a tone, color, and texture, and kind of somewhat Ligeti and Stockhausen influenced piece. But I would say that it was even after graduate school that I began. I went to graduate school and said, I'm going to write every piece in a different direction in order to learn who I am and what I'm doing. And that's exactly what I did. So I wrote pieces all over the map, everything from an absolutely berserk electronic and cello piece to, a piece for 6 trumpets and 2 pianos. Another 6 trumpet piece, actually, that was played the Gaudiamus Festival in Holland. There were 2 6 trumpet pieces on the program at the Little Concertgebouw, and the friend of mine had written the other one in imitation of mine. It was a hell of an experience, and just stuff, and it really worked. And at the end, I sort of began to home in on certain things that had happened in those pieces, and that became my voice. One of the things I said was, I don't care about innovation. I'm really tired. I'm in this school with artists and composers and filmmakers all running around trying to be revolutionary, and I just think it's ridiculous. And I said there are a certain amount of composers around here writing in the style of Schoenberg and Weber, who lived in Vienna 50, 60 years ago, and that's ridiculous because it assumes that it's just a technical feat and has nothing to do with the life you're living and the life around you, as if music is completely independent from life. And I found that artificial and ridiculous.
Good points.
So I was sort of rejecting some kind of very familiar parts of modernism and mainstream composition, which at that point was still very much influenced by serialism.
Dominated the university's landscape
Yes.
for decades and decades, even until I was an undergrad in the 90s.
Yes. And Cage was the other big influence, and I never gave a damn about his music either. I loved his stories, but I never gave a damn about his music. And at a certain point, I said, I don't care what I do. I don't care what my style is, as long as it's expressive. It is going to be expressive. And so homing in on some things that had been in the music hinted at, and saying, whatever it is, it's going to be expressive. And I don't give a damn whether it's radically new or not, as long as it's mine. And that's when I began writing pieces like Shorelines and Landscape of Traveler and the chamber music that I think really represents me.
Now, you have a steady inspiration from nature. When did you
Yes.
first to make that discovery, to find that? And obviously, that's a topic that's been, a lot of composers have found their inspiration in nature. I think it's universal. When did that strike you?
Well, I went on a hike senior year and climbed a mountain in New Hampshire, one of the roommates, and it just about killed me. But it also started a lifetime of hiking. I could not wait to get back. So in the 6 years I was teaching, 3 years in Marblehead, Mass, and 3 years in Vermont, I was hiking in the summers and weekends all the time, backpacking. I walked the length of Vermont. I did
Wow.
all these things, and I absolutely had a musical relationship to landscape. My orchestra piece, Landscape of Traveler, was conceived when I was sitting on top of Mount Mansfield in Vermont and looking at the hills, the rolling hills around it. And I said, this is counterpoint. I want to do something like this. And so in various ways, one of my best pieces is called Midsummer Variations. Even though it wasn't until it was finished, I didn't know what it was about. I had no idea of a theme for it like that until I was done, and suddenly realized, wait a minute, this is Midsummer. I've been reading Midsummer Night's Dream. That's what this piece is. So that has been steady. I would say what I'm aiming for as a composer now is to unify my earlier music with my later music, to find some of that wildness of the earlier things, and with the control and the expressiveness that I've found since, and see what what happens with this orchestra piece.
That's
But I want to
exciting.
do some pieces
And
too.
it's very narrative, and it's like an author's perspective on that too, is finding
Yeah,
that circle, right? To completing that circle, that loop, and
yeah,
I
completing
can't
the
wait to hear
circle.
some of those. You said you're working on a composition now. How's that coming along?
I'm poking around is what I'm doing, and I started to write a song, and then said I'm not going to write a piano part without a real piano. So now I'm not sure exactly what I'm doing. And of course, I'm scared. I'm scared to get back to the piano, and I don't know if the muse is going to be on my side or not. I have to find out. So I have to, there's a certain amount of resistance. The last piece I wrote was a cello solo, and for Rhonda Ryder, and she asked a bunch of people to write her pieces about Grand Canyon. She had no idea that I'd hiked about 12 times in Grand Canyon. I was the only one of the people she asked who had been there. So that piece was easy in a way because it's called The Silence at Yuma Point, and Yuma Point is a place that I've been in Grand Canyon, and it involved the sounds and the silences of that place. So that was not hard. But now thinking about in the direction of orchestra piece, that's going to be hard. And trying to do something that's new for me and to work up to it, maybe with some piano pieces and songs. So
I love how you talk about your work and how your journey is. Yeah, everyone's got such a unique journey. I love to talk to different people about their journeys, and of course, we talk about Mozart, who seemed out of the womb had this gift, but someone like yourself, who's steadily, slowly built his skill set, refined their talent, built slowly. It's a great lesson for people who are coming up today that not everyone needs to be the Mozart of their time, but like time spent diligently working your craft, honing, preparing, studying, that you find your voice in different ways.
and everything I do, I'm very slow. I'm a slow learner, but when I've got something, I've really got it. That's the difference. I know what to do with it, and I'm creative. I'm an innately creative person. My mother was a high school English teacher who taught through creativity. She had her students writing poems and short stories, and she would use that as grammar studies and punctuation as well as stimulating their imagination. So creativity in our house was kind of fundamental to the whole operation. So I was bound to be creative in one way or another.
And I'm reading some of your prizes. You were an alternate for the Prix de Rome in 1978, and of course we know some of the famous winners of that competition. And looking here, there's a list of accomplishment and awards and commissions, and it's taken you all over the world, working with some of the finest orchestras. What's it like as a composer to watch your piece come alive with a great orchestra? Orchestras are putting new pieces together. You know this. It's a scramble. There's never enough rehearsal time.
There's never enough rehearsal. Chamber music is much better that way. The chamber musicians, because they aren't usually getting paid for rehearsals a lot of the time, they have more time, and that's why listening to orchestra player music, there's nothing more terrifying. I mean, it is absolutely terrifying because you realize that there are 70 people up there sometimes, and one of them can screw up the whole thing. And I had one performance by a good smaller orchestra, and the entire bass section got lost in the first line.
Oh, no.
And they stayed lost for a while. And the feeling in your guts, hearing something like that, is really kind of indescribable. I mean, they pulled it together, and by the end, it was an okay performance. But my God, that was tough.
That's you write this. How long does it take it to write an orchestral piece? It could take you so long and so much time and thought. And
I'm slow. I'm slow as a writer. I draft fast and revise slow. It takes me longer to revise and polish than it does to. I've learned, by the way, a fair amount, a lot about composing from writing prose because for a long time, I composed section by section, and I would obsessively polish each section before going on to the next. And the result was that the pieces sometimes ended up more episodic than I wanted. And what I learned as a writer is you write through, you get it down, and it's bad, and then you go back and make it good. And when I learned to write, to compose that way, to let it be bad, to let it be unpolished, and to realize that, I think I also had this idea that an idea was either fabulous or not innately, but that's not really how it works a lot of the time. An idea can start off and you can turn it into something good. And there's no better example of that than Beethoven, who could
I
write.
was going to say his motivic, the simplest elements can turn into like the Fifth Symphony or,
Yes. And he can do sketches that are just absolute crapola and then, pound and pound and pound until it's great stuff. So I have to say, I have not learned yet as a composer what I've learned from Mozart and Beethoven, especially. I don't know. I've learned a lot, needless to say, because with Ives was so particular in how he composed. The most apt description for Ives, if you want to describe him, is Ivesian. He was simply a unique man and a unique composer. And you don't learn that. He was much more of a craftsman than he usually gets credit for, but it was his own kind of craftsmanship. And it doesn't really apply because we don't have the kind of folk music. And, I have written a sort of Ivesian piece, a string orchestra piece for Chattanooga. And I said, this is my hometown. I'm going to use Baptist hymns and things like that in this. And it's the most Ivesian piece I've written, though it doesn't sound like Ives. But by and large, you just can't use that kind of repertoire that Ives had innately, within him that he grew up with. We don't grow up with that kind of unified musical culture. He sort of owns that. So as a composer, it's tough these days because there is no standard technique. We're all, as composers, they're the rubble of all former systems of composition and all lying around on the ground. And what you do as a composer is pick up a bit of this and a bit of that, all the stuff that's lying around, and assemble it into a technique and a voice. And you don't have any choice. That's all there is to do because, we're spending a lot of time. You probably wanted to spend more time on my books.
We'll get there. I love this. This is, to me, the interesting part is digging into what makes an artist interesting and unique.
Well, there is no more horizons in a way. I read something that Alban Berg said once. He said, soon it will historically be possible to write a chord of 12 notes because they thought historically that way. Well, chords of 12 notes and white noise, which is theoretically all notes sounding, infinite notes sounding together, have been used in music, 50 or 60 years ago. So they're, in a way, the kind of sense of discovery in art that carried art for hundreds and hundreds of years is gone. You can't get more difficult and esoteric in literature than, say, Finnegan's Wake, Joyce. You cannot, in a way, it's something you cannot go beyond. It is perfectly meaningful, but it's not comprehensible to most people. You can't get more incomprehensible. You can't get more dissonant. You can't get, the harmonic horizon was reached many, many years ago. You cannot get more complex. So that sense that there are things that we can no longer surpass or discover. There's no more sense of undiscovered territory.
That's fascinating because it's given
and
us
that's a horrendous difficulty.
It's given us the rise of the minimalists. Like, look, I'm a big fan of Arvo Pärt, who studied of course, the serial composition and found that a dead end, and reevaluated his life and came up with this kind of sacred minimalism, which is, he has the tight compositional control, but the very minimal elements, and that's become like you hear it everywhere in Hollywood. People borrow his style all over the place now. So it's kind of like this reimagined
without
tonality.
his talent.
Right, exactly.
That's the problem. Minimalism without a lot of imagination and talent.
Ear candy, right?
I wouldn't be that generous. I tell people I don't like minimalism except for the pieces I like. But what minimalists did music a great favor, I think. I just remember when I went to a lesson in the 70s, and my teacher dropped the needle on Terry Riley's In C, and I just stood there with my mouth hanging open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I was Mr. Minimalist for a while, and I was cured of that by going to a concert of Philip Glass and Ensemble. I went in a fan and came out really, really annoyed.
We used to do the drop the needle, and it'd be like, okay, you can drop the needle anywhere, and it sounds the same.
Anyway, what they did though is by fleeing as far as possible from serialism, they sort of opened up the entire territory in the middle. And that's where most of us live creatively. And I think minimalism did music an enormous favor in that respect by blowing the reign of serialism out of the water. There's still serialism, but by the way, the most unreconstructed intellectual serial composer I ever knew was once lead guitar for a recording band called the Archies, who made the immortal "Yummy, Yummy, Yummy, I've Got Love in My Tummy."
Really?
Yes, I won't. He probably doesn't want me to mention his name, but most composers these days are old rockers. Actually, it's just the way it is.
That's fantastic.
I know, it's incredible.
We got our first question from the audience. Howard J. Smith, the author, a friend of ours, all we know certainly. He asks, when did you start writing your first book, and what led you to do that? Well, it was such a massive project, and for each of the books, was it like a journey? And like, how did you pick the topics? How did you pick this composer?
Well, I started writing through this magazine, New England Monthly. I simply saw, they're starting a magazine, and maybe they'll want a writer about classical music, and I'd always wanted to do that. So I sent them some stuff and immediately got hired as their main music writer, classical writer. And as I say, that's sort of what polished me, I think, as a prose writer. But meanwhile, I'd lost my last teaching job, and I had some friends who were writers that I don't hang out with academics. I never have. I hang out with composers and writers and painters. And I had some friends who knew I was literary. I was a big reader, and I could recite the first page of Finnegan's Wake.
Wow.
And things like that. And somebody called them and said they were looking. I didn't have a teaching job at the time, and I was broke. And somebody called them and said, I need somebody to write half of a book on the Civil War, an almanac of the Civil War. They said, well, we know this guy and he needs a job, and we think. And I started writing hack history, and I did this for 2 or 3 years for a dime a word. I wrote 6 or 7 books, and they don't have my name on them, and I'm not going to tell you the names of the books either. I'm not going to tell you my nom de hack, I used to call it. But I wrote books on the Civil War. I wrote books on mayhem and war that are sold at Kmart next to gaily illustrated books called The Armaments of the Third Reich and things like that. And that's how I supported myself and learned to write history. But these were hack books.
What a great lab.
It was a great laboratory. My boss said, just remember, for these kind of books, stealing from one source is plagiarism. Stealing from 2 is research. But I would use 6 or 8 or 10 sources sometimes. And basically, I learned to look at a source and say, what's this going to do for me? Meanwhile, I was writing for New England Monthly, and I wrote an article on Ives. And there was a guy there who had his own imprint at Houghton Mifflin, and he said, I said, what about I propose a biography of Ives? And he helped me. He spent about 6 months helping me with the proposal. And finally it was done. We submitted it to Houghton Mifflin, and they turned it down. So I had some friends one of whom had written for Norton, a book for Norton, and he said, I'll mention your name to the editor there, send it to Norton. And so I basically threw it over the transom, and they took it and paid me virtually nothing. I got $10,000 for that book, but I got a couple of grants too, one of them at Harvard, actually. And that's how it started. I had no idea. Well, I just sort of instinctively knew what to do at that point. Because again, writing these hack things, I would say, this book is going to give me this angle. This book is going to give me this angle. In fact, writing about the Civil War at one point, I literally read, the first thing I read was a World Book Encyclopedia entry on the Civil War, which was for children, but it was written by very authoritative people. Then I read the Encyclopedia Britannica on the Civil War, and that expanded things. Then I started reading books, and other almanacs that we were going to steal from. And I learned to gradually get into a subject bit by bit from different angles and understanding what each source was going to do. This was going to give me the big picture. This was going to give me intimate details and so forth. So I already had a sense of that. I just expanded it to write the Ives. The trouble is that Harvard had taught me everything about European music up to about 1850 and nothing after that. Mm. And they never went in harmony beyond 1850 either. So they taught you nothing about American music. So the first thing I did was to read a huge American history book. And then I started having to teach myself about American music practically from the ground up, reading books about American music. And then I knew I had to go. It was very simple. There were not that many books about Ives at the time. I knew I was going to go to Yale, where the Ives, 25 boxes of material, and look at the manuscripts. And I spent a whole summer doing that. And that was relatively easy. Then by that point, I'd also written a book called The Vintage Guide, which fell into my lap. Music appreciation book. And that went well. And the editor said, when you're done with the Ives, pick a composer. I don't care who it is, and we'll do it. And this is really no more complicated than this. I said, well, I don't think there's ever been a particularly good Brahms biography. And they said, okay, do that. That was it. And they paid me what I thought was a lot of money, but it wasn't. It was another economic disaster, but not as big as the Ives. And that was tough. I wrote that and pretty much finished the Ives when I was finishing the Ives when I got the contract. And I had to relearn German to do it, the Brahms. And I did that in 3 years. I finished the Ives, relearned German, did all the research for the Brahms, which was enormously more than the Ives, and wrote the book, and it just about killed me. It was absolutely brutal. And I was teaching, full-time in the fall. So I would go to school. I'd get up at 6 a.m, read about Brahms, go to school, teach a class, revise a chapter, teach another class, revise it, and teach another class, come home, work on the book till dinner, and work a little after dinner and collapse in bed. And I did that every day for a semester. It was tough. And the Beethoven was far harder. Because as I tell people, my Ives bookshelf is library is about 1.5 bookshelves. The Brahms library is about 2.5 bookshelves. The Beethoven was a better part of 2 bookcases. Just books and Beethoven-related books, European history and things like that. Viennese history, German history.
Being a renowned composer yourself and someone who loves music, I mean, these are sacred figures. I mean, you're dealing with the most important musical figures.
Therefore, the ones that are most written about, especially Beethoven. The literature of Beethoven is overwhelming. Sometimes I would just sit there for an hour in front of the screen, not able to get my thoughts together. There were so many sources involved on every page that I couldn't get my thoughts together. And I don't know if there's a chapter on the Eroica that I spent 2 or 3 months on, because I was doing both. We have a lot of sketches for the Eroica, and there's classic studies of them by Nottebohm. I was doing a process of composition and an analysis of the finished piece at the same time. And I've never in my life just felt confused, just lost in what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to say. And getting that straightened out took a long time. That book took about 12 years from the time I got the contract.
12 years, wow.
And the publisher had turned over 5 times, and the last guy said, oh, we don't have to pay this guy. His book is years late. We're not going to pay him. So I got screwed, and badly. It was a horror show. The Mozart, in that respect, was a piece of cake by comparison. I was still late. It's still too long, but the Mozart library is one slim bookcase. But Mozart is the hardest to write about the music. Beethoven has, implied dramas and narratives. And
times were changing. He's putting more of himself, I think, more of his own personality into that music, right? That wasn't Mozart's kind of way of thinking and dealing with life.
It was not his game. And the idea that you're supposed to express yourself as an artist just didn't exist in those days. And that I don't think Beethoven exactly thought of it that way either. But the idea that you're expressing yourself and it has to come out of yourself, your own demon, your own creative voice. That's something that the Romantic 19th century came up with, and partly because of the example of Beethoven.
Beethoven was opening that door.
Yes, and Mozart, by and large, didn't think of a piece as a narrative. What unifies his pieces is you can see what they are, but a lot of it's technical, and I didn't want to get too technical. I just find Mozart. I said to my old Boston Symphony, I've written a lot of Boston Symphony notes over the years. My old publications boss, I said, I find Mozart the hardest composer of all to write about, and he said to me, he said, "Well, duh." He said, "I've known that for 30 years." I just found it very, very difficult because his emotions are not necessarily, they're not on his sleeve at all. And often some of it is just beautiful. I realized I had to deal with the idea of simple beauty, and we're not taught about beauty. And beauty is, when you and I were in school, that had a bad rep. It was considered to be personal and mushy, and artists would put down beauty a lot. And it was indefinable and subjective and yada yada, but the reality is that beauty is a real thing, and dealing with Mozart, you have to deal with the issue of beauty. And I felt defeated to a degree about it. I felt that I had to be. I'm just a musician. I'm not a poet, and I felt that in some ways, to truly write about Mozart, one needed to be more of a poet than I am. But I did the best I could because it's my job. Whereas in Beethoven, you can talk about applied narratives and Darkness to Light in the Fifth Symphony and how narratives are inflected. And then when he left those kind of narratives behind in the later music, there's still it's what I ended up calling Beethoven's poetic period. The late music seems to enfold the whole of life, sometimes in one movement almost. It's a different thing, but it's still... Beethoven gives you words, and I think Beethoven wanted to be transparent emotionally. I think he set out to be transparent, and he felt anybody who was sensitive would get it. And the critics he most admired were people like Adolf Marx and E.T.A. Hoffmann, would write very fanciful, poetic things in response to his music, and he liked that. That's what he liked. He didn't really like technical analysis, Beethoven, at all. And the other thing about Mozart,
I don't think people could. He thought people could understand that he was so brilliant.
Yeah, and he was a pro in a way that composers just aren't anymore. Mozart was a pro. He wrote, and also this is very important. And I understand this as a composer. I think in a way that I've never seen anybody else who I think really understood this. This is very important. The first, up until one composers did not expect to be played after they died unless some of their sacred music might be in church. Monteverdi was the most important composer of his time in Europe, and he was almost completely forgotten 50 years after he died. Music had moved on, and that's what people expected. And what people heard mostly, except maybe in church, was new music. That's what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear new stuff by their favorites. And the first composer who really went beyond that was Handel, who just sort of stayed in the repertoire at full value. And Handel died when Haydn was in his 20s and Mozart was 3. So this idea that your work could stay as part of a permanent repertoire and you could have a certain immortality as a composer did not really exist before Handel. And it had not sunk in to Haydn and Mozart. They did not think of it that way. I've read some critics of Mozart's music who said this music will last forever and that kind of thing, but I never heard either Haydn or Mozart talk in those terms. Beethoven did. Beethoven used the word immortality. And when you think of your work as going to be heard in 100 or 1,000 years as part of a permanent repertoire, and your name is going to be immortal, it changes you as an artist. It doesn't necessarily in itself make you better. It has nothing to do with quality, but it's different. And so, as I ended up saying at the end of the Mozart, Beethoven's music, actually, his chamber music, was still mostly played in private. His string quartets. He was associated with the first string quartet in Europe who had a public concert series, but that was a new idea. his piano sonatas were never played in public. His violin sonatas and his chamber music was not played in public. But still, and a lot of his orchestra music was played in music rooms too. But still, he was sort of part of this professionalization of string quartet writing and professionalization of orchestra music. He was really more and more aiming for public performance. And he was writing for humanity. And what I ended up saying is that Mozart was writing for people. He was writing for people he knew. He was writing for people in private concerts. He was writing for publishers he knew personally. He was going to sell his music to. A classic case of that is the Kegelstadt Trio, this wonderful piece, one of the great masterpieces of chamber, one of the most beautiful works of chamber music, was written for a party. And it has an odd instrumentation of clarinet, viola, and piano, because it was written for his friend Anton Stadler, who was maybe the greatest clarinetist alive, for himself on viola, and for his student, this teenage girl was a terrific pianist. So it was written for his friend and himself and the student to be played at a party.
That's very much Mozart.
At the house of the student's family.
In your book, I love your description about the symphonies and how in Mozart, when he was growing up, and his father and him, the symphony was written to be performed by mostly amateur musicians in the Helms.
And often sight read.
Which is amazing to me. I've never really contextualized that. I'm like, that makes a whole lot of sense, because this is music and meant to be immediately consumed and enjoyed.
Yes.
Not a statement about this or that. That's not what its purpose was.
And a symphony was not yet the king of musical genres. Haydn made it, and he made it that partly because he went to London, which had a public concert life, and he was writing for big orchestras and big concerts, public concerts. And that's when the symphony Haydn made the symphony the king of musical genres. And that's where it was when Beethoven took it up and expanded it still further. But Mozart, I think his last three symphonies Mozart was in Paris when he was in his 20s. And that also had the Concert Spirituel, which were big public concerts. So that's when his conception of orchestra music, between that and hearing the Mannheim Orchestra, which was the best in Europe, that's when his idea of orchestra music began to get more ambitious. But symphonies just weren't that ambitious when Haydn and Mozart started. And Haydn made them into something ambitious, and Mozart followed in his footsteps.
I have to ask, if you could sit down with any of the composers you've written these enormous volumes about, what would you ask each composer?
The first thing I would want to do is not talk to them at all. I'd like to listen to them talking across the room. I'd like to watch them walk down the street. Because if I saw their mannerisms, the way they talked to somebody else, the way they walked down the street, it would completely change how I thought about them. I mean, that's what you can't know. And if I talked to Beethoven, I might try to draw him out a little bit about his technique, actually. He probably would resist it, because he did not like that kind of thing. He thought, you're mucking around in my workshop. It's none of your business. Write me a poem if you want to say something about my music. But I might like to say...
Or a 700-page book.
Page book. Now, if I got into the thing of, did this really happen, or is this true? There would be no end to that. And plus the fact that if I said to Beethoven, did you really meet Mozart, and did this really happen? He might say it did, he might say it didn't, but what he told me might not be the truth either. Partly because memory is unreliable, and partly because, Beethoven said that he heard Mozart several times play, and he said he basically said even when he played piano, he was a harpsichord player. That's what he's basically saying. He said he had no legato.
Makes sense. He would have harpsichord at home, and the piano was in its very nascent stage.
He clearly thought Mozart and Haydn were basically harpsichord writers and composers. Players and composers, even though there were a lot of piano music of a certain. And he wanted to be a real Beethoven. That's another thing that's very important about Beethoven that I understand as a composer. He was one of the first generation to grow up as pure pianists. And that had enormous amount to do with how he wrote for the piano and how different it was from how Mozart and Haydn wrote for the piano. And what Beethoven did when he was young is he always had models for everything he did. He'd look around and say, what's the best? Who writes the best orchestra music? Haydn and Mozart. Who writes the best piano sonatas? Well, I don't like any of them, but the most idiomatic ones are probably Clementi. So he studied Clementi. Who writes the best violin sonatas? Mozart. So that was his main model. Who writes the best operas? Mozart. Well, that was a problem because whether he admitted it to himself or not, Beethoven couldn't do what Mozart did as an opera composer. So he had to find another model, and that model became Cherubini. Anyway, so Beethoven definitely met Mozart. He supposedly was only in Vienna for 2 weeks, though, because he got called home because his mother was dying. And there's this story that he played for Mozart. Mozart wasn't all impressed as piano playing because Mozart was very hard to impress. But Beethoven said, can I improvise? And he started improvising, and Mozart went in the next room with some people and said, keep an eye on this kid. He's going to be something. Well, maybe that happened. What is true is that when Beethoven was 10 years old, this grubby little kid, a new teacher arrived in town and wrote an article saying this kid is going to be the next Mozart. And Beethoven never doubted that. Now, a lot of people have said from Mozart's time on, this person is going to be the next Mozart. Beethoven's teacher, Nathan, was probably the only one who was ever right.
Yeah. Everyone's always looking for that next, the next superstar, the next great, great one.
That was said of George Sell as a composer when he was a kid. This kid is going to be the next Mozart. Well, he became a great conductor, but he was not. I've met a couple of next Mozarts by their own testimony.
Yeah,
or their parents.
Several, yeah. I judge a lot of competitions, and you hear great talent. But I mean, I think the context of Mozart is so important because he was born into a musical family, and the father trained him in such a unique way. That must be, in reading your biography, really, you get the training was so unique, and the travel, the exposure to all the greatest artists at such a young age that he could absorb from, and he was such a fast absorber.
Well, his father was brilliant, Leopold Mozart. He was an absolutely brilliant man. He was a well-respected composer. His pieces, what few of them survive, they're really quite nice. They're very slick and professional. They just don't have a lot of distinctive voice, but they're very fine. And he's the only teacher his kids ever had. Remember, Mozart's sister was a prodigy as well. On keyboard, she didn't have much imagination, I don't think. She never had any inclination to write. I think if she had, he would have encouraged her. She just didn't. But Mozart grew up with this extraordinary, I mean, he knew math, he knew some history, he was a reader. He read some philosophy. Leopold has been treated badly often, and he became a pain in the neck, and he probably sat on the kid's earnings from the early travels for the rest of his life without admitting it, and lived quite comfortably on that while writing to Wolfgang these in rags. And he changed. I think people don't understand that Leopold changed. But when his kids were young, he was brilliant at promoting them and teaching them and exposing them to the best influences all over Europe. And he was an entrepreneur like nobody's business. Brilliant. And he ultimately wanted to make a lot of money and have his kid get a job.
I love the
as
story
a Kapellmeister and
all
support
the gifts
family.
and
That
the
was
snuff
the goal.
boxes and the gold encrusted
the
watches
gold
that they used
watches,
to pocket.
the snuff boxes full of Louis d'Or and all this stuff. Because he played for aristocrats mostly, and they didn't have to do anything. You were nominally playing for them out of duty, but they were always gifts. Except, as Leopold said, sometimes all he got was kisses from this princess, and if kisses paid the rent, we'd be in great shape.
It's a very German way of thinking.
That's a very Leopold way of thinking too. Now, Leopold wanted his kid to make a lot of money and then to grow up and get a great job at a court somewhere and support the whole family. That was the idea. And when Wolfgang went off to Vienna, and that was the end of that. I mean, for a while there was a fiction that he was going to be sending money home, but not much of that ever happened. And but nonetheless, their house in Salzburg was quite nice. It was a big, beautiful flat, and Leopold lived there very comfortably to the end of his life. And Nannerl, his daughter, stayed with him, and she sided with Leopold against Wolfgang, which was too bad. And he ended up marrying her off to a much older man with 5 kids and squelching an earlier romance, a guy she really wanted to marry. And she ended up a sad figure. Um, she she did play and teach. You couldn't, she couldn't have a piano career, a public piano career, because she was a woman. You couldn't do that. But the fact is, private performance was more important anyway. But she didn't have any particular drive. She wouldn't stand up to Papa. She just did what Papa said until he married her off.
So what would you ask Mozart if you could sit down with Mozart? What would you ask this giant?
We'd have some wine to start with.
I heard he liked Spaten. That was his beer of choice.
That
they market it like that.
Really? I did not know that.
They market it as
I
Mozart's
did. Let me
beer.
take that down. What a friend of his said is he drank copious quantities of punch. And I was thinking, well, is this alcoholic punch? Oh, yeah. I looked up the recipe. It is. What else would I talk to him about? When Mozart died, he was thinking of an opera based on The Tempest, which just absolutely breaks my heart. My fantasy is not talking to them as such so much as my big fantasy is bringing them back in a time machine, bringing Mozart up to the present and saying, look, here we are 200 years later. You are it. You are it. Now, finish the Requiem.
None of the completions are satisfactory.
Yes. And let's get a libretto of The Tempest. Would you like to do that? I think he would like to do that.
We all wonder, what would another 20 years of Mozart's compositions be like?
Well, we wouldn't keep him for 20 years, but we might keep him for a year. And we'd have more pieces by Mozart. And at some point we'd say, that cellist in the orchestra, she really likes you. Do you like her? And I've really been going over in my head, would we show him a computer or not? I think not. I think he might just spend time looking at pretty girls on the computer or something and not write any music, or just be so fascinated with this world and of the internet that he'd just get lost in it. But we'd show him a modern piano. We'd say, okay, there's this thing called a Steinway, and here's a very nice period piano, and here's a Steinway. And what music would you show him? That's a big thing in my fantasy. I don't think he would play him Stravinsky. I think that'd be a bad idea. He would hate it. And secondly, I think it might throw him off his course. But I might ease him into Beethoven, because Beethoven is founded on Mozart as much as anything. And I think he would immediately, you realize if Mozart lived to be 71, he and Beethoven would have died the same year. And I think those two in Vienna together would have been an incredible thing for both of them. Though I think it would have made things a lot harder on Beethoven. He really didn't have a major living revival except for Haydn, who was winding down when Beethoven showed up. There was really nobody else. And that has a certain amount to do with how he turned out too. There was no challengers, really. There were people that didn't like his stuff. There are always people who don't like your stuff. But he could pretty much follow his own path and not get too much grief for it.
Well, it's such amazing insights into these minds, and I love to think about these things. I'm like, boy, what would they think of some of the composers of today and the trends of today, and the internet and things like that. It's fascinating to consider. I mean, and would these great composers who were so productive, how would their productivity be today with all the distractions we face with television and internet and social media and all this craziness? But
also people like Beethoven and Mozart, there was a mechanism to identify talent and foster it that doesn't exist anymore. And it was mostly in the church and in courts and the aristocracy, the musical aristocracy. They were looking for talents. They were looking for, people to dedicate pieces to them. They were looking for people for their soirees. And that whole system, what it is now is universities. So universities gives you often this fantastic training, though often I think a lot of it is not very practical, but it's still a major training. And then they sort of throw you out and you have to make your own way. And you have to be an entrepreneur and know how to promote yourself as a composer. And there's nobody going to come and say, okay, you'll be my house composer and I'll pay you a living and you dedicate pieces to me. That doesn't happen. And music was a lot better off when that did happen. Or when people were selling their music and making a living selling to publishers, which happened in the publishers took over from the aristocracy as how composers made a living in the 19th century. It's because there was a big middle class market for music that also doesn't exist anymore because of media. You don't have to play piano in the parlor to hear a piano sonata. You just play it on the computer or put on a CD. It's easy, and that easiness devalues the music, I think. But it also makes it, by universalizing and totally democratizing it, it also makes it too easy and less special.
As someone who's been teaching in multiple universities, sometimes concurrently, what advice do you have for young people coming up in the world today who are musicians or lovers of music? What advice do you have for these people coming up in the world today?
Well, I'm not a good person to ask that because I've never done anything much in my life that didn't fall into my lap. In careerist terms, I'm a disaster. As my mother used to tell me regularly, and she was right. As a composer, you can't make a living, so there's that. But a lot of composers, well, of course you teach if you can get a good job. And I think it's better for composers now because when the composers started working in universities, they had to sort of conform to a scholarly model that is not good for creative people. I think there's still some of that, but maybe it's less so than it used to be. I mean, the arts are in absolute anarchy now. It's just utter anarchy. So, and you can be an anarchist as an artist in university teaching now, and they understand you've got to make a living. But the other thing to do is to band together with other people, find performances with other people in groups of composers. There are a lot of people doing that, but some people manage to get it together and do it better than others and get more of an audience. I went to a big festival, not a sort of a conference once about new music, and somebody was saying, all your new music concerts are full. What's your secret? They said, there was a silence, and they said, free beer. And your pencils going all over the hall.
They've discovered that in Brooklyn with operas. They're doing operas in like abandoned warehouses, and they're reinventing what it means to be an opera company. And their millennials like to drink beer when they're watching art.
That's right.
And they've been hugely successful.
And also doing things online. Finding people on YouTube. How much of I know Hillary Hahn slightly, and a certain amount of her career was made by these brilliant little YouTube things she did. Everything she does a special on YouTube. And there's some composers, if you can be a composer and find some way to get people to pay attention to you. In other words, you have to be clever in finding some way to get people to pay attention to you. What I think everybody of my generation came out and saying, I want to write the next Rite of Spring that will just revolutionize everything and blow people away and be like nothing anybody ever heard before. I don't think in the first place, I'm not sure that's quite possible anymore in the way the Rite of Spring was. Again, because the possibilities of discovery that were there in the time of the Rite of Spring are no longer there. Harmonic discoveries, melodic discoveries of color and complexity and things like that are just not there. You have to find other ways to do it. But what you do have to find is a voice. And a voice can't be learned or taught. It's something you either have or you don't. Some people find it, like Mahler found it right away. I didn't find it right away. Beethoven is interesting because we look at his Opus 18s and we say, this sounds really more Haydn-esque than Beethovenian, a lot of the Opus 18s. I was amazed by how polished and craftsmanly they were when I started to study them, because I'd always thought of them as kind of, apprentice pieces almost. They're not, but they're not as bold. But then I realized, wait a minute, they're Opus 18. The Pathétique, which is utterly Beethoven, is Opus 13. So he had what we think of as the Beethoven voice early on, mainly in music with piano, like the Opus 1, number 3 piano trio. That is Beethoven. But it took him a while to home in on that and to sort of say, when he said, I'm going to take a new path, I'm not satisfied with anything I've done. I think part of the new path wasn't really that so much new as it was a homing in on a certain aspect of voice that he had. And now he said, this is me. This is what I'm going to concentrate on. Now, he always had a number of modes and voices, but the real, here 3 seconds, Beethoven is what really started to happen in the second period, but it was based on, I think, pieces like the Pathétique in the first period.
Yes,
so even him, though, it took a while to settle
that voice
down.
And then being that voice, and then saying that the experimental phase, and then it kind of being absorbed into everything else he's writing, to the symphonies. Because looking from Symphony 1, 2 to 3, and like that monstrous period, it's all
4
experimental.
years. And that's a bigger journey than most artists in any medium go in their lifetime. Beethoven had this ability to make incredible jumps in a very short period of time. He did it over and over again in his life. Though the first symphony was not an ambitious piece. It was written very fast for a concert, and I don't think he intended it to be a big deal. The second symphony is a big, ambitious piece, but it doesn't sound to our ears that Beethovenian either. He hadn't really found his symphonic voice yet.
My favorite review is that I forget the reviewer called the last movement a wounded dragon
thrashing
about dying.
Yeah. You mean the second or the fourth?
I think it was the second.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that was the second. And the finale. The thing is that the second is a comic piece. The background of the second symphony is comic opera, and the finale is absolute hoot. It begins with, I can't never figure out if it's a hiccup or a jackass. But in other words, it took even Beethoven a while to settle into a voice, and you cannot teach a voice. It cannot be learned. It's who you are, though, like your back of your hand is. It is just there, or it's not. And most artists of all kinds never really do find a voice. They might find some bizarre way of putting a painting together, by throwing mud at it, or, painting over cow manure or whatever it is, which I'm sure has been done. But that's not a voice exactly. So that's something that I tell students about. In my writing classes, I used to talk about voice, but I didn't try to teach them that because you can't. But I said, this is what a voice is. This is Hemingway. This is Faulkner. This is E.B. White. This is what a voice is. Now, if you may have a voice, you may not. But, get your commas in the right places meanwhile.
Start there.
Write lucidly. And if you learn how to write expository prose lucidly and correctly, that will be a foundation from where you can go anywhere. Whether you're going to be writing academic articles or writing scientific things or writing prose or writing poetry even, you'll have a foundation in that. And if you go on to find a voice, then that's up to you.
Jen, I want to thank you. What an incredible mentor you've been to so many, from the university positions you've held to the speaking you've done to the writing that is still affecting millions. And people are really, I know a lot of people who've read these
millions?
books. And
Come
I think so. Certainly the Ives, with the movie that was made of the Ives. I hope millions do read it.
I ran into Tilson Thomas at an Ives festival, and he sat down next to me and looked ahead. He said, "Who do you want to play Ives in the movie?" And I said, "Tom Hanks," but he's too old now.
Not DiCaprio?
He could play George Ives. He could play the father. No, DiCaprio's too old now. I don't know who would do it now. It's not going to happen. Anyway, I don't think I have millions of fans, but thank you for saying so. I really appreciate it. I've never had an interview like this ever, and I appreciate you letting me ramble on, because I think
we got to do this again, because you've got so much to say, and we'll find
about
a
lot of
and
stuff.
Well, you've had a lifetime of drawing together these incredible, studying these people's lives so intimately, writing, studying, composing. You have so much to say, and I just find it fascinating.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your letting me go on because, the reality is, I think a lot of what I say applies broadly. It applies to writing and it applies to composing too. And I hope this is useful. I'm still a teacher at heart. I'm something like a third or fourth generation teacher, and I'm always interested in what people can learn. I have a thing on YouTube, how to write a program note that I did for a class. And I'd love to do something else, and maybe we could ramble in different directions. I'm sorry I didn't give you more of a chance to talk, but
that's okay. I like to listen. I learn more listening than I ever do talking. So I'm reading.
Well, absolutely. There are a lot of things maybe we could home in on some more specific subject for another talk. But I'm not terribly busy. I'm indulging. I'm spending a lot of time out in the woods, staring at ponds and trees and things like that. I had a horrendous freak accident in November that nearly broke my neck on a hike, and I'm still getting over that. But given that 5 months ago I was almost completely paralyzed, I'm doing pretty well. I'm walking miles and feeling pretty good. But I'm in the woods for both spiritual and therapeutic reasons.
Well, certainly we can relate to Beethoven in that same regard, walking in the woods, gathering inspirations from nature, right? That's I get it. Mahler, too, love to walk in the woods and hike.
I think somebody looked out the window of Mahler's studio and said, "Oh, this is fantastic." He said, "Forget about it. I've already composed the whole view."
Amazing.
Schoenberg said at one point, he said, I've heard that he said this, "I can't conceive of music that's not about something." And I think almost nobody has ever looked at Schoenberg that way, and they should. And I think he would want them to. They just
There's
look
a
at it
difference
as
between the
technique.
greats, like a Schoenberg, and then people who kind of adapted that style and tried to write in that vein. It's like people who try to copy the minimalism without the genius. It's not going to work.
And it's very easy to imitate Robert Frost, but it's all bad. And it was not easy to be Robert Frost. It's easy to imitate Schoenberg if you assume that it had nothing to do with his life and his personality. But of course it did. And the time that he grew up in, which was a wonderful, fascinating, exceedingly sick time of European history in Vienna.
Yeah, the dissolution of that society and kind of things falling apart. I read a lot about that, and I have a Holocaust survivor friend who I'm very close with, I've produced with, and we love to talk about these things. And she's a musician and studied musicology, so she was in Poland and lived through this time period. I just find it shocking. We'll have sushi sometimes and just talk about life back then. Incredible.
Incredible. And we can't know things like that, but art has to come out of your guts or it's nothing. It doesn't mean it has to be spilling your guts or that you have to have your heart on your sleeve, but it has to come out of your guts and it has to come out of who you are in the most profoundly deep way possible, which doesn't mean it's going to be any good. It may come out of your guts and be total crap, but it still has to come out of your guts, whatever it is.
And certainly good music doesn't come out that's not that way. I would agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah,
well,
even
Jan,
Brahms, he rarely admitted it, but he occasionally did admit it.
To hear these advice, you have so much to say, and I hope you do say it. I hope you come back. We definitely have so much to talk about.
Okay, I appreciate it very much. It's been great fun.
And we're going to talk soon. You have a great day.
Okay, take care.
Thank you for joining us on Music Matters with Jason Tramm. Please remember to subscribe to us and like our videos, and remember, keep music alive.